Vice President Bush flew to Cape Canaveral early this afternoon along with Senators Jake Garn, who flew on the shuttle mission last year, and John Glenn, who of course was one of the early astronauts. Vice President Bush and Senators Glenn and Garn now have just arrived back at Andrews Air Force Base outside of Washington, D.C. tonight. They were there to represent the president as Vice President Bush met with members of the family.
We had a very moving meeting with the families, and I don't know that I've ever been more touched because Mrs. Scobie, the wife of the commander of the flight, said she was speaking for all of the families, and the message that she wanted to tell the Vice President and Senator Glenn and I was that the space program should go ahead. They didn't want it slowed down or stopped, and they knew that their husbands and wives, families would want that too.
NASA is busy with an investigative team already analyzing what happened. They went through their plan with us before we left for how they're planning to investigate the whole thing. And they'll find out what went wrong before anybody else is launched.
John Glenn, who went to Cape Canaveral tonight with Vice President George Bush and Jake Garn. As you heard, they met with the families. The indication from the senators, of course, was that the families of those people who are the regular astronauts, the 6 members of the space crew, indicated to the Vice President that they wanted this program to go on. We have our correspondents assorted around the country right now. Steve Delaney is at Cape Canaveral, Kennedy Space Center, and Dan Molina is at Houston, the Johnson Space Center. Robert Brazell tonight is at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. Bob, let's begin with you. What about the future of the space program? We have talked about that at great length all day long. As you heard John Dancy say, Congress seems determined to continue it. But do you think it will continue along the lines of putting all of its money on the shuttle program, or will they begin to diversify?
Well, Tom, I think one of the things to consider is that right now there is this national pride issue that John Dancy was talking about that we must go on. But I think that as the hard financial decisions are made, some other things might come into play. And I think one of those things is that even before this disaster, and that's the most important point, is that long before this disaster, there were questions about the shuttle program and how effective it was. And I don't think anybody was saying that we shouldn't have a manned space program and that we should abandon a manned space program. But the fact is that many of the things that the shuttle does can be done by unmanned spacecraft, and perhaps much cheaper and perhaps certainly with less threat to human life. So that those kind of considerations may well come into play when Congress begins to think about whether to appropriate that extra $2 billion to buy another shuttle orbiter.
And Dan Molina, what are they saying in Houston in terms of the future of the program? All of the money continue to go into the shuttle program, or is there any talk around the edges down there, at least, of diversification of some kind?
Tom, we're really not hearing anything about that here tonight. I must say, walking around here at the Johnson Space Center this evening, what I see is an amazing focus of energy. It seems like the people here at the Johnson Space Center now are attacking the biggest problem perhaps that they have ever tackled, and that's finding out what went wrong with this thing. I see this focus of professionalism, which we've come to identify with the space program, mobilizing itself this evening here. There's none of the political talk here. What there is this mobilization of effort to try and find out what in the world went wrong.
And Steve Delaney at the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral tonight. What about the personal side? Down there you were mingling, as it were, as I guess a kind of novice yourself, watching the first shuttle launch that you have seen so far. The people who came to watch today, not only Krista McAuliffe's parents, but her husband and children, as well as members of her son's 3rd grade class were there. Are any of those people left around there, and what has been the personal reaction to what was witnessed there today?
Well, I think we have to go back to what the senators were saying when Senator Garn was saying when he came back. We have not had any contact with the members of the families, but I'd like to chip in a thought that because there was a teacher in space and because so many children around the country were watching this liftoff, it was almost their flight, their surrogate, their teacher, or somebody representing their interest was along. And it was a way to draw young people into the mystique of space, to kind of make the linkage between the John Glenn era and the idea of getting out and dealing with the idea that the future is really up there where those 7 people disappeared to tonight. That one of the things that will impel more movement toward finding out what went wrong and towards coping with the disaster that happened here today is to redeem the American promise, the promise of space for those kids. to indicate somehow to them that it shouldn't end this way, or it shouldn't be a setback, that there is something grand and something glorious to be attained out there, and that the space program, almost for that reason, will have to go on and will have to redeem itself and to kind of erase what happened here today.
Robert Bazell in Pasadena, I want to talk with you about some of the personal side as well. You knew Dick Scobie, who was the commander of this flight. In fact, you had a conversation with him at one point about the possibility that something could go terribly wrong, as it did today, didn't you?
That's true, Tom. We've been talking about that a lot today on many of the NBC programs. Dick Scobie was a fighter pilot. He was a test pilot. He was decorated. He had received many medals for action in Southeast Asia. And we were driving back from the Cape one afternoon, and he told me that he thought that someday this would happen. He said, he put it very bluntly. He said, someday the shuttle's going to blow up. And I think his wife expressed what were his views, what he told me, this was several years ago. He said that he really wanted the shuttle program to go on, but he said that it was inevitable. It's a complex piece of machinery. It's got enough explosives in it to make it into a small bomb if something goes wrong, and that's exactly what happened today. So I don't think to the astronauts in the program, I don't even think to the engineers in the program that this is a terrible surprise that this happened sometime. I mean, nobody knows why it happened today, but I think that everybody thought that it was inevitable that eventually it would happen. Obviously, it's a terrible setback, and nobody ever wanted it to be, but as some of the people we've talked to over the course of today have pointed out, it's a machine, and no perfect machine has ever been built. And when this machine went wrong, it caused a terrible tragedy.
The fact is that it's sometimes hard to convey the commitment and the dedication of the astronauts to that program. They have given up their life in many instances to NASA, and I don't mean that in the cruelest possible form, but that is it's a very rigorous program in which they're engaged. They have to move to Texas in most cases. They spend long hours at what to the rest of us would be boring, even tedious tasks. They have to face disappointment. Some of these people who have been in the program for a long time have not yet been in space. They've had to wait for many months, even years to go up. Judy Resnick was one of the astronauts who died today in the explosion aboard the Shuttle Challenger. She was someone that I knew relatively well because we met when the first shuttle was scheduled to be launched, and she was assigned to NBC News as our expert commentator. And I used to talk to her about this at some length. Here was a classical pianist. She had a PhD in electrical engineering, and yet her life was absolutely given over to NASA and to the idea of being an astronaut. At the same time, she did have a pretty good sense of humor. We used to have a little friendly bet from time to time about whether NASA could keep its launch schedule. And when I lost one, for a six-pack, quite honestly, I sent it to her at some expense, wrapped in a dozen long-stem roses. And she immediately sent back the message that she loved the beer, but the roses she didn't need necessarily. So these are people who believe very strongly in the space program and want it to go on. In all the history of spaceflight, however, there never has been a disaster like the one that we witnessed today. 7 lives lost, 7 families in mourning tonight, along with the rest of the nation. And as NBC's Dennis Murphy reports now, the grief is shared by the entire NASA community.
Across the bay from the launch pad, Titusville, America's space town, was stunned and silent at the news.
Now the close-up on your left, there is the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning, about 11:39 Eastern Time.
Offices stopped.
We will not speculate as to the specific cause of the explosion.
I just started crying and backed up and walked away because I knew it was really bad.
And all of us would stand up, we just couldn't believe what was going on, just in total shock.
It's really subdued. It's hit this area real hard. People take it real personal. This is the pride of Titusville.
Titusville and the shuttle program are inseparable. 3 of the 5 city councilmen work for NASA. The astronauts killed in 1967 are remembered in city street names. The Chamber of Commerce has an old Titan missile in the yard. The elementary school is called Apollo, and the high school is known as Astronaut. There are 14,000 people here who work in the space program, an army of specialists who put man in space. City manager Hector Figueredo.
It's the same thing, the same feeling that we have here when President Kennedy was killed.
And the cloud just stayed over us like a fireball.
And Titusville has hosted tourists like Oliver and Joyce Boland from England.
Terribly sad, but it is and does have an objective, whereas blowing people up in Libya or Vienna Airport has no sense, no objective whatsoever. So I'm sure you'll go on with the space project, and I'm sure it's right you will do so.
With the families, the friends, the school children who watched this morning, Titusville mourns. Dennis Murphy, NBC News at the Kennedy Space Center.